So what I'm going to talk about today is partly in response to having watched The Craft about 4 times over the past 2 weeks, and I've been pulling this talk together, but partly something that's been striking me has been around for, I don't know, a while since I've been thinking about where technology and hauntings and the supernatural start to lock into each other. And that's kind of in terms of visions and in terms of expectations and in terms of what actually is being summoned into the world and by who and in what way. And there's been elements of this that have been kind of touched on today, but this is something that, like I said, I've had in my mind for a while. And quite frankly, any excuse to kind of watch The Craft again repeatedly was welcome. I will say at this point, the original slide deck was primarily going to be Firuza Balk, a lot of her. I've pulled back from that to kind of get more relevant slides in, but there's still some, so we're going to work with that. So The Craft, for those of you who don't know it, it's a film from 1996, and it's kind of in the supernatural, pop culture, teenage, high school horror precursor to Buffy and all the stuff that came after that as well. The plot line is fairly straightforward. There are 4 girls, they meet each other at high school. They're all having a fairly horrible time of it in various different ways. 2 of the girls are being bullied, one's being slut-shamed, one's being racially bullied. One of the girls is also, the third girl is also being bullied for having various kind of scars on her. And the 4th is just having a pretty miserable time of it with a really horrible home life. They find each other, they get together, they figure out that as the 4 of them, they can form essentially a coven. They start to do magic. They start to kind of summon forces together, and their lives start to change. And it's a great mid-90s movie. It's got a soundtrack that is exactly what you expect, with kind of things like Elastica on it. It's got a very, very, very young Neve Campbell in it, very, very young Firuza Balk, very young Skeet Ulrich, and it's generally kind of part of the genre. It works pretty well. So kind of in all those ways, it acts as this kind of precursor to what is the horror of high school life actually like when you're a teenager, and what would it be like if you could actually start to summon magic into that world as well. So kind of on that level, it works, it's fine, it's great. But what's really interesting about it when I kind of watched it on multiple viewings is the magic that they do. There is a bit of material magic in there. There is some physical stuff and physical changes to the world that starts happening. But a lot of what they do, a lot of their kind of their summonings, are about kind of changing visions and changing expectations as well. And it initially also happens after they've had they've tried appeals to reason and to science and technology. So 2 of the girls who are being bullied go to their tormentors and say, essentially, what's happening? Why are you doing this? What's going on? Why would you do this? Could you just please stop? And their tormentors say, no. I mean, just no. Why would we? One of the girls, the one who has scars on her, goes through what is implied to be the latest in a very, very long line of kind of medical treatments that are costly and that are deeply painful and appear not to be working. And the girl, Nancy, who's having a horrible home life, there's nothing really she can do about it. She's still a teenager, she can't leave, she doesn't have the resources. So it's not until they start summoning these visions and expectations into the world that the world itself starts to change around them. So they do things like they change how they look, they start to cast expectations around love, they start to cast visions around death, around serpents, around kind of spiders, they move in and out of each other's dreams. There's a lot of kind of how the world changes when they start to kind of change the expectations and visions that come around it as well. So this is interesting, because what's happening here isn't just that they set up a fantasy, they set up a glamour and something happens. What happens is they set up this change of scene, and suddenly the world starts to move it around it as well. And this is kind of like, the latest in a very, very long line throughout kind of magic, throughout history, throughout technology, of people who can invoke visions, who can see things, who can go beyond some kind of like material realm and kind of grab something and pull it through for whatever ends there are. So, things that you might see in the smoke or see in the dust or see in the entrails or hear in the air or kind of find in the water, or things where you go to a circle and you hold hands and someone tells you and grabs your face and tells you, actually, I think there's someone in this room who has a relative who might be dead, who maybe their name begins with a J? Yeah? You went to the beach once? Yes, brilliant. Okay, come forward. There's this idea of kind of this visions that go beyond what we can just see now. And that's kind of really interesting, and it always has been, but it's this idea that what is beyond that is actually in the power of it. It's the expectations themselves that start to change the material qualities of our world, material qualities around science and technologies, around our political activities. That it's not just that the entrails have been read, but the fact that you now have to make a decision whether you're going to war that morning or not. It's not just about the fact that probably your dead Uncle John maybe is telling you that they think your boyfriend is pretty horrible, but whether you then make a decision to dump them or not, or whether you read out the horoscope and then make a decision about where you're going to invest your money that day. So the visions themselves start to grip onto and shape and twist the world it's in, and as we know, the kind of science and technology are a part of that world and are dragged through this expectation and vision-making in its own way. In the craft, the girls call the four corners. They call the north, the south, the east, and the west, the guardians of the watchtower. And that's what we're going to do to finish this off. We're going to drag those things through fire, through air, through water, through earth, and we're going to see what comes out the other side of it. In 1953, the US military did the first ever test flight of the F-102A Delta Dagger plane, which is what we can see up here. And it was part of the Cold War effort. It's an air-to-air interceptor. It's rigged up with various electronics, so it can track other planes. It can shoot them down. It has missiles. It has rockets in it. It's a very, very clever piece of kit. It was there were about 1,000 of them made. They did the first test runs in 53, and they brought them up into the air, and they sent them out in 56 to work. What's interesting about this is it was one of the first supersonic planes that went into full use. And supersonic planes are those which can travel beyond the speed of sound and past it. So planes are noisy anyway. Planes make a rumbling sound as they tear over, and at the moment there's a fair amount of legislation in place about how airspace can be used by planes, where they can be used at night over which areas of land. Supersonic planes go beyond that because as they break the sound barrier, they shift the pressure of the air around them, particularly as they're traveling over land. It rises, it dips, it rises, and then you get the sonic boom, and that's really loud, and it's really, really aggressive. And it's one of the reasons why at the moment we don't really have any commercial supersonic planes, because there's legislation in place that says you cannot have these types of planes in flight over land in the US or in Europe. But this was 1953, and they developed this thing. So they brought it out, and they brought it into being, and they were going to send it off, and why wouldn't they? It was effective for exactly what the US military wanted to do, but to get it out from the US air bases over the land and over the sea and over potentially to where Soviet aircraft might be, it had to go over civilian space. And it was loud, man. It was loud. It had this sonic boom that came with it. So in order to try and, they weren't going to take it back, right? They'd spent a huge amount of money, technology, investment hauling this thing into being. But in order to try and keep the people around them on side, to make this thing something other than a quite terrifyingly noisy thing, the group Convair, who had developed the technology, brought into play a series of adverts. What they depict is a very classic American pastoral scene. It's a village, there's a blue sky, obviously overhead. There are many, many small houses with many, many, many actual white picket fences in it. There's a milkman, there's a few churches, and flying over this scene, gloriously up in the sky, are three of these guys, as seen from the bottom up. And the tagline, the text on this, reminds those who are looking at it that the US Air Forces, yes, we're at war now, and we're located near to key cities, and the airmen in these planes maintain a round-the-clock vigil ready to go at a moment's notice. And this is the text. That the next time you hear jets thunder overhead, remember that the pilots who fly them are not willing disturbers of your peace. They are patriotic young Americans affirming your new sound of freedom. So that is the sound of a sonic boom. That is the thing that when you hear it rumbling is the thing that is reframing your expectations about what this massive crack of sound actually is. And like I said, these things are loud, but it's nothing to be scared of. In fact, it's something to welcome, because when you hear it, it means you're safe. We can change the expectations. We can try and change the expectations that come around to technology when it's out in the world. This thing that might look like this, that might be noisy, that might be terrifying, that might have a bundle of other meanings bundled up with it. We can try and cast some counter spell onto it, some counter vision to say, actually, it's safe. Actually, it's a new sound. So the sociologists who work in this space, who do work around the sociology of expectations, have said, and this is from a group of them, that novel technologies and fundamental changes in scientific principles do not substantially pre-exist themselves, except and only in terms of their imaginings, their expectations, and visions that have shaped their potential. What do you see? What drags you through this? And this is important, right? Because visions provide the expectations, and expectations are generative. They make things happen. They make things happen materially. They make things happen politically. They make things happen culturally. So they start to steer activities, and they bring interest in, they bring money, they bring strategies, and as we'll see, they bring structure and legitimation as well. And this isn't just something that happens at the end of the process. This is something that starts to run and creep all the way through it. It's not as though you get this jet out in the world and you think, well, Christ, now we have to try and explain it. There's a vision and a series of visions that start to run into play from the very start point of the technology itself as it moves out into the world. Now, this kind of matters when we're thinking particularly around innovation and technology, because innovation is kind of fundamentally forward-looking. It's not really, you don't really develop things without expecting them to have some kind of impact and, impact on the world itself. Innovation is generally creating new technologies and new things is about intentions. You're having the intention of making something and seeing how that thing starts to shift itself. So you can't really work through making, through generating, through creating without some kind of expectation about what you think is going to happen in that place and who specifically you think is going to be affected by it too. So, the next watchtower of water and feeling. Now, one of the expectations that come into place is this idea of this idealized behavior of the future users, of who's going to be using a technology and how they're going to be using it. And this kind of vision can start to kind of scrape through the process of development right from the very beginning, from the point where things start to get bundled together, resources get held up, projects get pulled over there, kind of PowerPoints get made, presentations are held, and an idea of we're making this for this person and this group, and that's how they're going to behave. And this kind of this spectral haunting that that funnels through. So around last autumn, Apple released a new health app as part of their new iOS, and a friend, a technologist down in London, Nat Buckley, went through this and kind of realized as they were kind of looking through the health app that there was absolutely nothing in there at all that would allow for the tracking of menstruation, the tracking of periods. You couldn't track it yourself from this app, and you couldn't really use third parties to integrate this either. You could, if you wanted to, on the phone check, your stocks and your share prices, but that wasn't necessarily, there was kind of an expectation about who might be doing that instead of who might be, wanting to track their periods. So already there's kind of this idea that whoever's going to be using this and using it to try and get a sense of what a phone can do and what kind of apps might come with it, either the idea that they're not necessarily going to be menstruating or that the idea this has been completely abstracted from them from the beginning. And so that's kind of the absence of a vision, the absence of this spectral vision of this person who might be using it. And even when kind of the vision kind of gets scraped and bundled into the technologies themselves, it still can get weird and skewed and warped quite easily. And there are a ton of examples I could have picked for talking about kind of the scripting of users into technologies. But I went for kind of period apps because there's a lovely moment at the very, very beginning of the craft where two of the girls are talking to each other, and one of them kind of is wielding this massive almanac that she's got in her hands, and says, well, I think the almanac says that something will bring something today, something will happen. And Nancy, who's played by Firuza Balk, just sneers at her and says, yeah, I think I'm getting my rag. So there's a lot of kind of period apps that kind of recognize, there are people who are going to be wanting to track their periods using this thing, but it still kind of has a very specific idea of who these people are. It tends to assume for a cisgendered woman, it tends to assume for heteronormativity, for a form of sexual activity that is probably going to result in pregnancy, and it assumes that there'll be the only reason really to use any kind of period tracker would be to kind of match fertility against menstruation to see where those two things look together. And there's no real idea in these things that there's any sense that you might use it for any other health reasons, curiosity, wanting to scrape the data and turn it into some gigantic art project. It's just this very tight, narrow focus of kind of fertility and menstruation held in place together. And these things as well also abound in with a very kind of fixed idea of what femininity is as well. They're generally kind of bright pink or puce or magenta, and they're covered in flowers, and they're fairly horrible. And I can't speak for anyone else in this room, but I know that when I get premenstrual, that my mood tends between murderously angry and tearful. So I mean, it's kind of like Patrick Bateman, but crying. And, a bright pink period app at that stage doesn't generally tend to it's not generally what I tend to need. But the kind of, again, this aspect of kind of female, of health also gets bundled into the actual technology itself. And after this health app came out from Apple, there was a wonderful article that got written in The Atlantic by Rose Eveleth that kind of started to pull back and was just like, hang on one second, how deep does this actually go? And she was looking at kind of quantified self-technologies as well, and got the sense from looking at them that the technologies that were being built kind of into phones as far as the kind of tracking systems were being built and predicated on the idea that the person who was using them would have them around all day. So, as one of the people she interviewed, Whitney Erin Boswell, said that many apps operate on the assumption that your phone is always connected to you in pockets that, women don't really have. So, and again, this goes beyond gender. This is there's an idea of this very cultural specific, this expectation of a user who's always going to be wearing quite snugly fitting, probably trousers, probably with a bit of a pocket where they've got the phone on them constantly, so you can get this kind of passive data tracking that comes with them as well. So this might just be oversight. It might just be an inability to recognise the structures around gender and race and sexuality and privilege that kind of permeate everything. Or there might also be deliberate political intents that come with summoning expectations as well. So visions are highly political. And again, you can see this in terms of the position that seers would have with armies, that the position that an astronomer might have with a member of parliament. It's not just that they provide a vision, but they provide a vision as a mean of kind of hauling resources in and a mean of kind of cementing a point of view and then getting that point of view and getting it through the world. It's not just about having this thing, it's about what this thing actually does as well. Now, you see that a lot with the kind of work that's been happening around, I want to say, the gentrification, the overhauling, the massive rebuilding of kind of cities, particularly cities in the UK, but you've seen it in Manchester, but also particularly in London, where there's cranes everywhere at the moment, like some kind of zombie army horde for developers, just kind of doing their will and changing the world around them. But in order to kind of get this stuff into play, in order to kind of shape the material landscape of the world itself, you still need to have visions in place. You still need to have something in place that's there to say that thing. Can you see that? That's what we're moving towards. So if you kind of just bring in money and you bring your investment, then that's where we're going to be going with it. That's over there, and that's fine. And it's happening kind of in two parts of London in particular, and both of which, to an extent, were linked to the Olympic legacy in one way or another. Down in Soho, before the Olympics happened, there was an attempt, and with other parts of London, to kind of clean it up and to make it a space that was safe, where people would come, tourists would come, they would spend their money. So there's kind of this visioning happened to kind of scrape Soho out from being what it had been and to being a kind of a sanitised, safer place. And what's involved was scraping out what property developers and what development agencies were defining as least desirable elements of this. Of the area, groups who'd been in play for a very, very long time. So this included sex workers. This included some of these sex stores, which are now being shut down. In the past few months, past few years, that's also included various queer, various LGBT clubs. So all these things have gently started, and not so gently, started to be pushed and shifted and closed out of the area, because that's not what the people who are trying to summon resources into the area necessarily want. But it's not just enough to kind of have that. There's also this kind of trying to cling on to some form of histories, whilst you're projecting this imagined future out to try and summon forth the future with it. So this is kind of a form of place branding, which Marjana Johnson talks about as saying, the aim of it is to present a sanitised and appealing image of place, which inevitably selects certain elements to be included in official messages, whilst disregarding or erasing other elements as well. One of the interesting things about Soho in particular is that the architecture involved in this have been very clear in their role specifically in transforming what they describe as, Soho's seediest alleyways. And they're going to scrape it out and they're going to fill it with visions of delis and shops and restaurants, nice clean things that will kind of summon people into that space. But this kind of imaginary city, this form of utopia, doesn't really exist on its own. While it wishes away the dirt and the complexities, it kind of offers a reconstructed past to hold it up as well. And one of the things that they're keeping for this area, which they have on their website and amidst all the renders as well, is the historic, in scare quotes, neon sign for the strip club that was owned by the pornographer Paul Raymond for Raymond's Review Bar. And they're keeping this, that's fine, because that's just a nice little kind of image to kind of ground these things in as a global icon for Soho, but not anything else that kind of might itself be associated with these elements. But that thing in itself, that's fine, that's safe. The other part of the city in London where this is happening is around, as Natalie mentioned earlier, around East London and Old Street. And in 2010, the government started to try and bolt on a legacy vision to the tech cluster that they saw was happening there. They were trying to support it, they were trying to bring internal investment in and external, particularly foreign investment in, and they were trying to do what they called as trying to bring together the excitement of Shoreditch with the heart of the Olympic Village. But in order to do that, they had to kind of get some big visions hauled down from the sky with very, very large ropes and very, very large bits of machinery as well, and trying to desperately make this thing stick. Because what they had didn't really work, particularly as a vision. In some of the material they produced for foreign investors, they said, well, this is East London. And so you want East London here, and if you look at it, you've got Shoreditch and you've got Stratford. But those things on the map are miles apart from each other, but were held up in this vision of being this single space where the money could generally be poured into. The other thing which made it difficult was the naming of it. And the naming of this area kind of went through the kind of the flapping changes that you kind of see with horror movies like The Thing, where the thing is desperately flipping between different types of identities and forms, trying to find something to grip onto and just stick, but it can't. I don't know if it's going to work if this goes slowly, but we'll see how it goes. Let's see. So it started with East London Tech City, then it became Tech City East, then it became Tech City UK. Tech City UK. And now Tech City, it's not actually Tech City Croydon, this is Old Street, but there's still this kind of, it's been like, they're just like, what, where, there? No, Christ, make it Croydon, fine, okay. Now it's more of a franchise than an actual thing itself. The most interesting thing about this from my perspective is that it hasn't stuck, right? You can throw a vision out in the air, but it doesn't mean that anyone's going to hold on to it if they don't want it. So there's these kind of fabulous modes of resistance that are out there. And this is work I've been doing for the past few years with Max Nathan and Emma Van Door on kind of what's happening here. Kind of starting from, I think, the principles that a lot of social research start from, which is kind of, what the hell? And then you go on from there. And the interviews that these guys did very early on, they said Tech City is what government people call it, and I don't think I've heard anyone call it Tech City without some sort of air quotes, right? It's a vision, but it's not a vision that's sticking particularly hard at the moment. It's still not got the, it's got the politics, it's got political agency behind it, certainly from a kind of an urban planning and support point of view, but it hasn't necessarily got the power to wield it. So visions get embedded into policy, and they're about exacting wide-scale change, but you need power to push these things through. You need kind of big cases, big kind of support to try and get this thing ultimately to hit the ground and to get it there and to make it real, to summon this vision out of the sky. Now, one of the biggest spaces where this idea of anticipation and vision-making and expectations comes in is with this idea of responsible innovation, which is very broadly this idea about trying to address massive, massive social problems through some of kind of curating and care for the future by setting stuff in play now. And so these are big social problems that kind of require large government intention and organisation to be brought into them. It's kind of, I would say, on the scale of the Jaeger program. That was one thing that struck me when I watched Pacific Rim. But the other one as well is climate change. This is one of the massive, massive kind of global, all-encompassing problems that needs a fair amount of visioning and a fair amount of expectations to be set up and say, we are going to make big changes. We have to make big changes, and it's going to involve all the governments, and it's going to involve huge amounts of organisations. It requires will and it requires intent. So, Christ, we need to make sure that we can set up some expectation to get there. There are ways of kind of addressing climate change, and reducing emissions is one of the big ones. But one of the other things that's kind of come up in the past few, like really comparatively recently, in the past few years, is this idea of geoengineering. And this is broadly by attempting to apply engineering to the air, to the earth, to the oceans, and potentially to fire as well, in some way to kind of bring down carbon levels, to change the earth itself, to reduce the kind of climate heat. The ideas that have been offered up by geoengineering are, at the polite level, fanciful. They might be some people have referred to them as magical, and not necessarily in a pleasant way. They are fantastical. They might be something that you could think of in terms of Dan Dare comics, would not be a million miles from this. So these are ideas that have been mooted in terms of geoengineering, what might it involve? So you might want to, via some fantastic balloon, spray sun-reflecting chemicals into the atmosphere to make the planet reflect more sunlight, maybe. You could fertilize the oceans with iron to produce algae for carbon sink, maybe. You could enclose the Earth in a ring of space dust, woo, maybe. And the maybe is like the massive part here, because none of this is real yet. These are just ideas that have so far been churned up as a way to kind of potentially address climate change through this thing. But if you're perhaps not being so charitable towards it, as many, many social scientists are, you could call these ideas wildly, utterly, howlingly, barking mad. You could call them things like the new best bad idea. They're kind of the ideas around geoengineering could potentially be classified as kind of like the bad idea bears of, heavy engineering. They're not real, but they're also not particularly good either. Like, the technology does not exist. None of the technologies that have been proposed around these things really on a massive scale have existed, at all. They're ideas, they're summonings in the ether. We haven't been able to get close to doing these things than we have been since the end of World War II. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the visions aren't starting to have some kind of effect on the world. There was a report that came out from the National Academy of Science a couple of weeks ago by 16 major scientists. And while they'd said, yeah, some of these ideas might be a little unrealistic, some of them maybe not. But maybe we should do some more research. Like, just a bit of research, just see which of these ideas are feasible, see, what might work for us, because climate change, it's a big thing. We should probably try and figure that out. And this might sound reasonable. This might sound like, yeah, okay, like we've got these ideas, these visions over there, maybe we could start to kind of haul them back a bit and see what kind of hits the ground. And in a piece that Jack Stilgo at University College London wrote about this, he was just like, but the worry is the research programs might themselves contribute to the overhyping of geoengineering as a possible alternative to conventional approaches to climate change. What this means is by doing, firstly, you've already got these narratives in place, and when you start to get these narratives in play, that starts to kind of actually start to make them real. They're not really real yet, but they're starting to get real because they're familiar, and when they're familiar, they're knowable, and people are, oh yeah, no, I've heard about that, yeah, no, okay, are we not doing that? I thought we were doing that, okay. When you start to do research, and there is small amounts of research on this, when you start to do the kind of the big-scale research that's supported by large, brilliant scientific institutions with potentially government or private money, you start to summon this thing out of the air, right? You start to kind of make these narratives normal, you legitimate them, you make them move beyond performative expectations, you get research streams set up, you get postdocs set up, you potentially get new journals maybe, you get conferences, you get legitimacy. And this thing that was there as some kind of like no good bad idea is now suddenly kind of there and suddenly kind of happening. It's this summoning of, and it also abstracts away, it takes attention away from other forms of action that could be taken, like reducing emissions. But this is just like, oh, okay, just that small thing right there. At the end of the craft, things kind of fall apart, really. The girls have summoned all this stuff into being, and they can't control it. Like, the love spell goes horribly wrong. They realise their behaviour's being changed. They realise that, there isn't the things that they were wanting. They can't deal with it when it comes, but they also don't have control over it. The Neve Campbell character goes to the owner, the Sarah character goes to the owner of the magic shop and says, "My God, what have we done? I've set up this love spell. How do I take it back?" And the owner of the magic shop just looks at her and says, "Like, how do you stop the floodgates? When these visions are out in the world, what are you going to do? These things are there now." But it ends actually not on that bad note, but it ends as a kind of a form of countering of the visions. Sarah, our protagonist, has managed throughout the film itself to develop her own visions and her own power particularly, and when targeting them against the other leader of the group, manages to kind of collapse that collective vision down and bring it to a space where the visions themselves are countered and gently flattened, and there is relative calm by the end. So visions and social expectations are about power, and they're about the contest to shape the future. They're about ascribing meaning to certain concepts, about hauling them into being, and those with power and dominance will certainly have some form of strength and effectiveness in defining and diffusing what our future would be. But there are always going to be modes of resistance in this, and the battle over expectations itself is never actually complete. Thank you.